Okay, class, today we're going to do a video lecture since I couldn't make it in today. This is going to be the lecture for the 2.4 Notes Community Interactions. We have two learning goals associated with this lesson. The first one, by the end of the lesson, you want to be able to explain the competitive exclusion principle. And second, you want to identify an ecosystem stage of ecological succession. Now, this one you may not be able to do until we finish up the lab that we're going to start tomorrow and also next week. Well, let's first talk about interactions among species. Now, it is common for the niches of two species to overlap. We commonly call this niche overlap. This increases competition among the two species, and of course limits the availability of resources. If they're competing for the same food resource, then there will be less of it to split between the two species, and also as a result limits population growth. There are 5 types of interactions among species that you're required to know. The first one is interspecific competition, which is competition between 2 or more species for the same limited resource. So the word interspecific is talking about between different species. If it was intraspecific, that would be competition within the population itself. Interspecific is looking at 2 populations of different species competing. Another type of interspecies competition is what we call predation. And this is when a predator feeds on a part of another organism or the whole organism. I think we're pretty familiar with this from our last lab that we did. Now, there are a few examples of predation. For example, there's pursuit and ambush, where a predator uses speed as an advantage. You can see that would be pictured by the cheetah down at the bottom. Mimicry is where a non-toxic prey is protecting itself by mimicking or looking similar to another toxic organism. The picture of the 2 tree frogs on the right shows you an example of this. One of these are 2 separate species. One of them is toxic, the other is not. So one of the species has mimicked the morphology and color pattern of the toxic species to be protected. There is also camouflage, or blending in, and this is where predators, if a predator employs camouflage, they're usually trying to hide and ambush prey, whereas prey try to just simply hide from predators. The picture at the top is a sargassum fish. Sargassum is a brown algae that floats in the ocean, and if you look closely, you can see that there is a fish that's got spots all over him, and his fins are look very foliose, almost like the algae itself. He likes to lurk in the weeds and wait for a small fish to pass by, and then he gobbles it up. There's also chemical warfare, and this is where prey can use toxins, bad taste, foul smells, or an irritation to avoid being eaten. One of my favorite examples of this occurs in the aphotic zone of the ocean, or the part of the ocean that has no light. There are some shrimp that actually, if they're threatened by a predator, will eject a bioluminescent or glowing glue on the predator itself. So it's not toxic, but what it does is it makes the predator glow in an area that has no light. So it kind of makes the predator susceptible to his own predators. Continuing with the 5 types of interactions, we also have parasitism. And this is where one organism, the parasite, gains energy by living on or inside the host organism. Can you tell which of the 3 pictures to the right is an example of parasitism? It may be hard to discern at first, but the correct answer is the one at the bottom with the clownfish. If you look very carefully, there is a little parasite living inside the fish's mouth. So it actually has latched onto his tongue and eats the food that he's trying to eat. This is a very dangerous parasite for fish to get, so they are always looking for ways to get rid of it. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. We also have mutualism, and this is where the 2 organisms interact and mutually benefit, or in other words, they both benefit. This is pictured by what we see at the top. What you see in the middle, that little purple and yellow fish, is a Spanish hogfish. The fish around him that look like they're trying to eat him are grunts. and they look like they're trying to eat him, but actually they're not. They're opening their mouths wide because they want that little Spanish hogfish to go into their mouths and clean all the parasites out. So in other words, they want to make sure that that little fish cleans out any of the nasty parasites that could grow up to be the parasite you see in the clownfish. There's also commensalism, and this is the commensalism benefits only one species, but the other just is not impacted. This is what we see pictured in the middle with a plant called a bromeliad. They commonly grow on other trees, and the advantage for the bromeliad is it gets higher up in the canopy of the forest to get more light. The tree it grows on is not affected or harmed by the bromeliads growing on them. Well, now let's focus on the competitive exclusion principle. We talked about two species competing, and if their niches overlap significantly, then they're going to suffer. They're going to lose access to a resource. What happens more often than not is one species will competitively exclude the other. In other words, it wins the competition. The excluded or losing species must do one of the following. They must migrate to a new area, adapt via natural selection. In other words, they need to find another resource, or face population decline or extinction. Here's an example of the competitive exclusion principle at work. We're looking at three separate species that grow in an intertidal area. We could just say that grow in a habitat. You can see the red species here. This is what its population curve looks like when it grows alone and is not restricted by other species in the area. Same thing with the green. You can see they show a classic logistic population growth where you have exponential growth at first and then it levels out when it reaches the carrying capacity. But notice what happens when they interact. Notice that the green species is competitively excluded by the red species when they are when they're growing in the same habitat. Similarly, when the blue and green species are together in the same habitat, the blue species is competitively excluded, or in this case perhaps just reduced as far as its number in comparison to the green. So you can see these three species have this interaction of dominance as far as their competition. You could say red dominates green, green dominates blue in a given habitat. Now the second major topic we need to focus on is ecological succession, and this is going to set up our lab that we're starting tomorrow. Ecological succession is the gradual change in species abundance and diversity in an ecosystem over time. When we think of ecological or the word succession, you might think of the succession of kings. One king replaces another over time. Well, there's two types of ecological succession. One is primary succession, and this is the establishment of a biotic community from a previously lifeless terrain. Then there's secondary succession, and in your notes you can just actually not write ecological succession here again. I should have erased that. It should just be primary succession. Secondary succession follows a disturbance, such as a forest fire. So primary succession may result from maybe a new lava flow creating a new rock on the land, or perhaps the retreating or the melting of a glacier exposing new rocks as well. Secondary succession always follows a disturbance like a forest fire storm, or perhaps clear cutting or mowing that we see as a result of human activity. Now in these events we have various stages of succession. Your pioneer species, or early successional species, are the first to move into the ecosystem. And if we look at a typical forest ecosystem, the pioneer species, or early successional species, tend to be lichens and mosses. And this is because they're very good at exploiting the new habitat. They can even grow on rocks, and they actually break the rocks down into soil. Now, over time, the ecosystem will build up more and more soil from the bedrock, so that allows mid-successional species to move in, such as herbs, grasses, and shrubs. So now these grasses and small plants can extend roots down into the topsoil that's forming from the pioneer or early successional species. Well, over time, you get more and more topsoil, and so now you can have larger plants like trees, or late successional species move in, their roots can now penetrate deeper into the ground, and we get closer and closer to what we call a climax community, which is a stable community that some say is the last stage of succession, but usually it's not. It's just it's a stable part of the ecosystem for a while until there's a disturbance like a fire or something. So here's a great description of that. You can see early on, if we go from left to right, it shows you the stages of succession. The first ones to show up are usually lichens and mosses. Then you have your grasses and shrubs. Then you have small trees, likely pines and such, and then your large broadleaf trees, your hardwood trees, usually end up making what we call the climax community in a forest. Okay, let's revisit our learning goals. The first one was to explain the competitive exclusion principle. So if you can do number 1, or at least list the 5 types of species interactions, like predation was one, competitive exclusion, and then there was mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. That's good, that you're at least at step 1. But if you can define all 5 types, that puts you at 2. Eventually, you want to be able to explain the competitive exclusion principle. That's our ultimate goal of getting to number 3. 4 is where you want to be able to provide examples of those different species interactions in nature. Like you can look at an example or find an example of mutualism or commensalism in the world around you. Here's the second learning goal. If you can at least define ecological succession, that's a 1. If you can contrast primary and secondary succession, that's 2, so you can tell me the difference between the 2. But if you can look at an ecosystem, particularly a forest ecosystem, and identify a stage of ecological succession, that's where we need you to be for the test. 4 is predict how ecological succession will affect an ecosystem. So this kind of advanced, you might actually be able to do that once we finish our lab. So that wraps up this lecture. I just want to remind you that tomorrow we will be starting the lab outside, so you have to make sure you wear long pants and closed-toed shoes. So we will be going outside. I don't want you guys stepping on a snake or anything like that. That wouldn't be good. So, all right, see you all tomorrow, and have a good day.